Well, good morning to all of you. I thank you, Dr. Patterson, for the introduction, and I'd like to express my appreciation to the organizers for this opportunity. I'm not necessarily used to coming on to a warm-up of a son of a preacher man, but we'll give it a shot. I'd just like to preface my comments by saying that my focus will be dedicated energy crops, and specifically those adapted to the southern Gulf Coast region. I'd like to just acknowledge my collaborators in the agronomy department, Drs. Erickson, Woodard, Vendermini, Gilbert, and Gallo, graduate students Na, Fedenko, and Castillo, and from horticultural sciences, Dr. Chase and Lopez. I'm going to approach this in this way. I'm going to address the issue of why grasses initially, talk about then some of the challenges associated with their production, and then research to clarify and identify opportunities and address those challenges. If we start by thinking about why grasses, a point that is very commonly made is that the use of cellulosic feedstock does not divert food crops to energy use. In this figure, you can see the corn production in the U.S. and where it is allocated. You'll notice that the yellow highlighted area is that which is utilized for alcohol for fuel purposes, and it's increased dramatically in recent years to the point where it's reached 5 billion bushels, which is actually greater than that allocated to feed. In addition, grasses, at least some of them, can be grown on marginal land that is not suited for row crops. And the photosynthetic pathway of C4 grasses, those specifically adapted to warm climate areas, characterized by twice the nitrogen and water use efficiency of that of temperate species. In addition, as others have pointed out, the climate of the Southeast is particularly well suited for biomass production in terms of temperature and rainfall patterns. And grasses provide a series of ecosystem services which we value greatly, including wildlife habitat, providing improvements in soil quality and water quality. I'm going to take just a minute to look at one of those soil quality issues with you, and that's the sequestration of carbon in soils. Some of my colleagues later will be talking about forest systems, and when you look at forest systems, it's very easy to see the carbon. It is right in front of you. In a grassland system, it's a bit more challenging because 90 to 95% of that carbon is below the soil surface. From a global perspective, grasslands play a very important role as about a quarter to a fifth of the total global soil organic carbon is below grasslands. If we use the example of miscanthus, data here, recent data published showing sequestration of 0.5 to 1 metric ton per hectare per year in a long-term system. If you're a visual person, you may appreciate this perspective a bit better. This is an example of Bahia grass, which is not necessarily a biomass forage, but a pasture forage used in the Southeast. On your left is Bahia grass growing in a pot typically used for trees, and we did that so that we could accommodate the root system and then characterize it. And you'll notice then on the right, we've removed that top growth, and what you see is what was in the pot in terms of the root rhizome mass. So again, clearly a significant role of below ground plant parts. Numerically, we characterized those plants, and on the right side, you'll see that the mass of below ground parts was between 75 and 80%. So those, very briefly, are some of the reasons why grasses are considered as potential feedstocks. Now I'd like to address some of the challenges with you. These have already been discussed to some extent. The issue of conversion will be discussed later, but the specific platform, the efficiency, the cost of those platforms is an issue. The chicken and egg dilemma has already been addressed in a number of venues relative to which is sited first, the processing facility or the land allocated to growth of these crops, and then the issue of sustainable production systems. Within the context of the latter, there are issues of economics, there are issues of land use decisions and prioritization, and also ecosystem impacts. I'm not very well equipped to address the first two issues, and so I won't deal with those. My focus will be on the sustainable production system area, and there are many topics that could be discussed, and for the interest of time, I've limited that to these four. We'll talk about providing biomass to the biorefinery, aspects of reducing production cost, minimizing resource utilization, and lastly, addressing the invasion threat. So I'll simply follow those four in sequence. Initially, and again, we're trying to elucidate some of the challenges that we face initially, and then we'll go through these same four and talk about them from a research perspective. So providing biomass to the biorefinery is one issue, and associated with that is species selection. What you see in front of you is some of the cast of characters that are often mentioned as possible biomass feedstocks within the region of the southern Gulf Coast. There are also challenges in terms of providing biomass to the biorefinery in terms of the seasonal distribution of that biomass. When we're talking about removing crude oil from the soil, we don't need to worry about seasonal growth patterns and weather conditions, but clearly with biomass, that's a significant issue. The second challenge that I wanted to identify and discuss is reducing production costs. Again, there's a whole list of aspects that could be developed relative to this issue, but I've chosen to focus on just one. And that's the issue of nutrient dynamics and nutrient inputs. High yields by necessity require significant nutrient inputs. Some people try to argue against that basic biological principle, but I would suggest it's at their peril. Highest yielding perennial grasses in some of the trials that we've conducted remove at least 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Just to look at some of the cost figures associated with that level of input, if you figure that nitrogen's costing now about $2 or more per kilogram, and yields can be achieved somewhere in that 25 to 30 metric ton per hectare per year level. If we do that math, we find that the nitrogen cost alone can be $400 to $500 per hectare, or $13 to $20 per metric ton of biomass. So that's a significant chunk of biomass cost that is represented simply in terms of nitrogen inputs. Another issue is minimizing resource utilization. In an area where food and fuel are competing, this becomes a particularly critical topic. Again, I'm going to focus on a single issue here, recognizing there are many, but there's not sufficient time to deal with all of them. The one I've chosen to address is water. Again, photosynthetically, you cannot separate water and biomass production. High yields require high water inputs. Just as a general guideline, somewhere in the range of 225 to 250 liters of water required per kilogram of dry plant biomass. So again, if we use that number of 25,000 kilograms of dry biomass per hectare in a high yield system, and we do the math, that's about 5.6 million liters of water per hectare. And if you think in terms of gallons and acres, that's about 600,000 gallons per acre to achieve those type of yields. Clearly that's a sobering fact, and it also emphasizes the importance of regions like the southeastern U.S. where we have high rainfall for biomass production. The last then of the challenges that I want to mention is addressing the invasion threat. Most of, particularly the perennial grasses that are being put forward for use for biomass feedstock are not native to the area, to the region of production. Some of those grasses have been shown to demonstrate invasive potential, and there's a concern among a number of communities as to whether or not that invasive potential will be adequately assessed prior to their use. So, those are some of the challenges associated with production of grass feedstocks for biomass. And with the remaining time that I have left, I want to go through each of those 4 areas and address them from a bit of the research perspective that we have carried out at the University of Florida. So relative to providing biomass to the biorefinery, again, we have the questions of which species, and then are there management practices that can increase the uniformity of distribution of biomass. I'm going to use this slide for a number of, or there'll be a sequence here using the same slide, and this is addressing the issue of species selection. At the bottom where the arrow is, you'll notice a group of perennial grasses. There are 6 there that were evaluated over a period of 4 years in North Florida, looking at, in the first 2 years, at a single harvest per year, and in the second 2 years at a 2 harvest per year system. If we look at Miscanthus within our environment, it simply underperforms, and so from a biomass yield perspective, it is not very well adapted. If we look at sugarcane and Erianthus, the issues with them tend to be long-term persistence and yield, particularly in the cooler areas of the Gulf Coast region. Sugarcane does not perform that well. If we look at Arundodonax, a giant reed, there are a number of issues. One, it's relatively slow to establish. It is also prominently mentioned as an invasive threat, and as we'll show in just a minute, it's a bit of a water hog. That leaves us then with these 2, energy cane and elephant grass, which are the primary grasses that have been identified, perennial grasses, for use in our region. From an annual grass perspective, sweet sorghum has received significant attention in John Erickson's group at the University of Florida. He's evaluated multiple sites, multiple varieties, and planting dates. I won't go through this in great detail, but I'd like to point out then that he has calculated some potential ethanol yields using this approach and the assumptions that are listed. And again, I won't go through this in regional detail and variety detail, but just to make the points that are listed at the bottom, potential ethanol yields at locations throughout the state of Florida are in the range of 400 to 600 gallons per acre, which we find are fairly similar to those associated with corn grain in the Midwest. The other issue relative to providing feedstock to the biorefinery is that of the issue of uniformity of distribution of biomass throughout the growing season and attempting to keep those biorefineries working over a longer period of time. One of my students, Chayan Na, did some work looking at harvest management as an attempt to address this issue with elephant grass and energy cane, looking at two harvests per year versus single harvests in fall and winter. You can see in these data that there was no apparent sacrifice in terms of biomass yield associated with multiple harvests. That fact alone can extend the delivery period from a period of a month or 2 to a period of perhaps 4 to 5 months. One issue that arose in the 3rd year of that trial was that there was a yield reduction associated with the multiple harvest treatment, and so that raises the issue of whether we need to think in terms of development of types that are more persistent under multiple harvest regimes to address this issue. Contrast that to winter-only harvests, and these are harvests that occurred immediately after first freeze, and you'll notice that there was no year effect in terms of biomass production. If we go back to this slide again, just to get at this issue of multiple versus single harvests, if you look at the circles at the top, you'll notice that for elephant grass and energy cane, yields were very stable over a 3-year period, including the 3rd year, which was a two harvest per year system. But in the 4th year, where again those plants were harvested twice a year, the yield decline was fairly precipitous. Moving on then to address the cost issue, and again I'm going to focus on nitrogen for the sake of time, but these data show those numbers where we indicate approximately nitrogen removals in the range of 200 kilograms per hectare per year for elephant grass and energy cane. So the question, or a question, is are there other nutrient sources that may be available that we could use? within our program, we took a look at wastewater treatment residuals, particularly municipal biosolids. Castillo and others published in 2010 these data looking at substituting proportions of municipal biosolids for inorganic nitrogen fertilizer. If you go down to the line where 67% of the nitrogen was provided by municipal biosolids, you'll note that the yields there were 82% of the inorganic nitrogen control. As expected, yields do decline with use of municipal biosolids because we are talking about an organic form of N, and nitrogen mineralization must occur before that can be utilized by the plants. One of the issues with using organic amendments is that of potential phosphorus impacts on the environment, and that was an issue that we attempted to address. You can see here that where a third of the inorganic nitrogen is substituted by the organic source, it was a very good match in terms of the amount of phosphorus that was applied and that which was removed in the crop. We're also interested in whether there were management practices that it could increase the impact or the efficiency of utilization of the nitrogen from the municipal biosolids. And we looked at simple incorporation of that material and were surprised at the extent of impact. We had about 25 to 30% greater nitrogen mineralization associated with incorporation into the soil. And you can see in this visual the impact in terms of yield and the fact that there was no difference between soil-incorporated municipal biosolids and inorganic N. The third issue that I'd like to address then is minimizing resource utilization. And again, we're going to focus here on water. About 2/3 of human water withdrawals are associated with agriculture, and that is only going to increase if we're counting on agriculture for liquid fuel production. So water use efficiency is clearly a critical issue in terms of biomass crops. My colleague John Erickson in his lab looked at this issue with 3 grass species: giant reed, which is a C3, energy cane, and elephant grass, which are C4 species. Energy cane and elephant grass in this particular study yielded giant reed, and interestingly, the transpiration rates were actually somewhat less. In terms of water use efficiency, and these data are calculated in terms of liters of water per kilogram of biomass, so a low number is good. Elephant grass and energy cane had approximately twice the water use efficiency of giant reed. So overall then, I think we can say that water use in this particular study, it was actually greater than the rainfall that occurred. So if we wish to achieve maximum yields, it's probably going to occur under irrigated conditions. However, considerably somewhat lower yields can be achieved under rain-fed conditions. Species differences in water use are significant and will play an important role in their future use. The last issue then that I'd like to talk about with you is addressing the invasion threat. For that, again, there are multiple species that we could consider, but I'm going to discuss with you elephant grass or Napier grass, Pennisetum purpureum. Elephant grass is native to Africa. It was introduced to Florida about 100 years ago, and at that time it was distributed throughout the state in forage trials. Additional introductions, selection, breeding, and so on was carried out at Tifton, Georgia by Glenn Burton, and Bill Anderson and others have followed. And those types that were selected there were found to out-yield other candidate bioenergy grasses in the southeast. The issue here is that elephant grass has been found to be a weed in sugarcane fields and also has been found in roadsides in some natural areas. As a result, the IFAS assessment at the University of Florida has considered elephant grass not recommended because of its invasive potential. Our question was, do elephant grass types selected for use as biomass crops then have the same invasive potential as those that occur naturally throughout the state? And in this visual, you can see a naturalized type growing on the right with a selected type or improved type on your left. What we did in this case then, when we went throughout the state of Florida and identified naturalized populations, and our goal there was to represent the geography of the state, so we collected from north to south through the region. We then compared those in replicated plantings at 2 locations, one in North and South Florida, with 6 cultivated types. Colleagues in Hortsai then looked at some of the genetic relationships and degree of genetic relatedness among these types. And you'll notice in blue, cluster 4 there, which is 5 of the 6 selected types. So they tend to cluster, and they are genetically quite different than most of the naturalized types. Another interesting feature of this analysis was the naturalized types tended to cluster by geographic region in the state. As you can see, a North Florida cluster, 2 clusters that were collected from Central Florida, and then at the bottom, 1 from South Florida. We were also interested then in some of the morphology and growth habit of these types. Again, the cultivated type on your left. This is 18 months after planting in rows, and the naturalized type has lost the row identity associated with its spread between rows and outside the row. One of the mechanisms of spread is they tend to lodge very easily, and they root at the nodes. Lastly then, just want to look at a few characteristics associated with these species. I just picked one late flowering breeding line, so this would have been one of the 6 so-called cultivated or selected types, and compare it to the average of the naturalized type. So in terms of plant height, an increase of about 21% associated with the late flowering type, 63% greater leaf length, over 100% greater tiller mass, and interestingly, 40-day later flowering, which is very significant for our purposes because it increases the length of period during which biomass accumulation occurs. It also pushes seed production back much later in the fall during a time period when you're more likely to have frost events that would preclude seed set. So then from the perspective of addressing the invasive threat, we've found clearly genetic, morphological, and flowering data that show large differences among types of Pennisetum purpureum. Those differences clearly indicate there is a range of invasive threat, and decisions on whether elephant grass may be used as a bioenergy crop should take these differences into account. So in conclusion then, the future use of perennial grasses as dedicated energy crops clearly faces a range of challenges. Our research has successfully identified types that are well adapted to our region, management practices that have the potential to improve seasonal distribution of biomass, some alternative nutrient sources to reduce production costs, species that are more efficient in terms of water use, and genotypes that diminish the risk of invasiveness. And with that, I'd like to recognize some of our funding agencies, and I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Patterson. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got time for several questions. Let's see, one over here, one in the back.
I was wondering, are you at all concerned about insects and other pests eating your grasses? Typically when we plant something that we like, nature tends to want it as well. And you didn't address that at all.
Okay, so the question is related to insect tolerance and insect and pest problems. One of the key issues that we found, and I'll get to your question fairly directly, with energy cane, there is a Smut Disease, which is a significant production issue that's being addressed in breeding work. We've had minimal insect damage. Grasshoppers tend to like elephant grass and energy cane, and we've had some defoliation. But relative to it reaching any kind of an economic threshold, that's not been our experience to this point.
Was there any effect of or did you take into account the age of stand for these naturalized population? Did it have an effect on the genetic diversity?
Okay. Unfortunately, we don't have any information relative to how long those naturalized populations have been where we found them. After collection, then we planted them in replicated plots at 2 locations throughout the state, and then evaluated them over a period of 3 years. But specifically how long they had been, my best guess is that because of the distribution of those, they probably link back to those early introductions in the early part of the 20th century. But unfortunately, I don't have any ability at this point to document that.
There have been now, elephant grass breeding for several decades. Have you noticed any tendencies in old stands towards these invasive habits?
Of the so-called selected or cultivated types that we evaluated, most of those were actually materials that were developed probably in the 60s through the 80s. And they've been in nursery areas since that time. We kept them in nursery areas at one of our locations near Gainesville during that time period until when we utilized them for these experiments. There was only one of those types that showed significant characteristics related to invasiveness in terms of early flowering and growth habits that more typically resembled the naturalized populations. The others were fairly distinctly different.
Question in the back, in the corner.
Thank you. Do you know what the relative water use efficiency is of carinata and sweet sorghum to elephant grass and energy cane?
Probably the greatest issue driving that water use efficiency is going to be C3 versus C4 carbon fixation pathway. And so sweet sorghum, by virtue of its C4 pathway, is likely to resemble elephant grass and energy cane to a much greater extent than it would giant reed, for example. So what was the explanation for the reason why there was no difference? What's our recommendation? Well, the challenge or the concern that we observed was that downstream, 3 and 4 years out, you may begin to show some persistence-related issues with multiple harvests per year. I feel confident that that's an issue that can be addressed with breeding and selection. So in our environment, clearly for a several year period, there was no difference in treatment. And so if there are advantages in terms of providing biomass to a biorefinery for some period of time, there's no penalty for doing so. However, I would be challenged to say that you can do that indefinitely without yield penalty.
There was one more question, a couple rows back.
I had 2 questions. At the beginning of your presentation, you said that the 80% of the grass is on the ground. I don't know the significance of the percentage, since the underground part is not used for fuel production, right? And the second question is that you said a big chunk of the investment for the plant growth is the nitrogen. You need to fertilize them with nitrogen. How significant is the nitrogen fertilization? What happens if you don't fertilize them?
Okay, well, let me quickly address that one. My colleague Bill Anderson is in the back of the room, and I know they've done some work where for over, I believe it was a 4 or 5 year period where they did not provide any nutrient inputs. And over time, they had significant yield reductions, and he can give you more details on that. If you turn around to your right, you'll see Bill, and he can talk to you at the break about that. But I think clearly in situations, particularly in sandy soils in our region, where organic matter is very low, Nitrogen removal in these crops is going to gradually run down whatever nitrogen you have available, and eventually you're going to have stand-related issues. The other issue that you raised was the question of the relevance of the below-ground portion of the plant. For most grasses, particularly under repeated defoliation, the below-ground portion is extremely critical from a perspective of providing reserves and bud sites for regrowth, both following a defoliation event and in subsequent years. So from that perspective, it's extremely critical, and one would manipulate that at their own peril.
Okay. I think in the interest of time, we need to move on to the next speaker.